Hello and welcome to The Real Reflected, where I try to have a philosophical look at events or phenomena that exist in our society. Today, I would like to have a look at quite a big one, which is called climate change or global warming. Now, as always, this is a very complex question, a lot of different sides and aspects. So, as I always say, I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm trying to develop sort of philosophical perspective on this. But I do think that for the purposes of what I want to do today, it's important to look a bit at what's being said politically about this before we delve into the philosophical details. Because we'll see that we'll need some of these notions later on. So what is being said? Now let's just stick to what was being said at the level of governmental policy, right? Because of course the political spectrum is quite large. There's many different parties and movements that all have a voice with regards to this issue. But let's just stick to, official governmental policy. Maybe you could just divide it into two sides. There's the people that we call climate skeptics. And it's not like they don't believe in climate change, but I think the idea is that they don't believe humans are the primary driver, right? So it's to say, we're not responsible for this. So consequently, there's no need to really change the way we live, right? So that seems to be the general idea. Now, often these people don't have particular arguments to back up their position. Rather, they just attack the opponents, right? Typically, that's what happens. So they will say the people that actually present climate change as a catastrophe, as something extremely urgent, they're actually just trying to execute a political agenda, a left-wing political agenda, an environmentalist political agenda, right? So these are then the people from their point of view, from the opponent's point of view. These are the people that threaten our way of life, and we need to defend our way of life against those people, against the environmentalists, etc. Right? So that's one side of the debates, let's say. And then on the other side, you have people that do want to take action, right? That do recognize climate change is an issue. We need to do something. And these people, they typically say, again, this is at the level of official governmental policy. The idea then is we need to adjust our way of living, right? We need to, what does that mean? Well, we need to reduce pollution levels. We need to reduce our carbon footprint, etc. Right? So the idea is we need to act, right? We need to do something. But the paradoxical consequence for me, if we look at this both sides, I don't think I'm being intellectually dishonest by saying it this way, is that both camps, if you will, they agree on something, which is that we need to find the way to salvage our way of life, whether by not changing anything at all or by adjusting it. The idea is what can we do to save it, right? That seems to be the common ground here. Now we need to just keep that in mind because I want to develop this. I'll come back to this later. So the idea that climate change appears as something related to our way of life. Our way of life is quite a vague idea, so we need to come back to this and maybe see if we need to redefine this later. Right, so now getting more into the philosophical side of things. What I'd like to do first is just to see why does climate change appear as a problem? In what context does it appear? Now, the way climate change appears as something urgent is in the context of our way of life, and more particularly our way of producing, right? This system of producing is the major source of pollution and all the negative consequences that come from that. So what is the production system that we have today? Well, this is quite clearly, it's what we call a capitalist economy, right? A system at a global level, our system of producing is a capitalist economy. So it works by using resources to produce goods and obviously services that produce added value that can then function as capital in order to generate more capital, etc. Right? Now, the system in terms of how it works, I want to just look at it a bit more in detail. Of course, I'm not going to go into a deep and in-depth analysis of capitalism, but I want to use a sort of technical notion to allow us to make a little bit more sense of how it actually works. The notion I want to use is subsumption. So it's something that you find in what's called critical theory, or the kind of theorists that really analyze capitalism into more detail. So subsumption, which means subordination, is the way in which capitalism subordinates different elements into the operation, into the mode of operation of the system. So the first step, the capitalist production system reappropriates the product of the workers, right? And so they lose that. So that's being subordinated to the logic of capitalist production or accumulation of capital. And the second step, all conditions of the labor process are being reappropriated, and all the workers, what you can call their subjectivity, is being subordinated to that process, right? And that's when you have, for example, the context of factories and things like that. So I think there we find a next level of this process of subsumption, which perhaps we can call planetary, which means that everything that seems to be available on our planet is being used as a resource in order to be transformed into the production process. So I'm going very quickly here, of course, but globally you can say the system only works by the exploitation of human, social, and natural resources, right? That's how the system ends up producing and then also producing capital. So that's the production system today, very briefly put, of course. So we can immediately see that the issue seems to lie with production as such. So I want to go into more detail, go a bit deeper into this philosophically, and look a bit at what is production. Now, we need to take a step back here and not look at industrial production or something, but just production in the most basic sense of the word. So just making something. What is it to make something? I'd like to use some ideas developed by a German philosopher of the 20th century called Martin Heidegger, and particularly an essay that he wrote in the early 1950s, which is called The Question of Technology. Now, just as a little side note, this is perhaps a bit academic, but I think it's important to note that the word he uses in German is Technik, which you can translate by technique, but in English it has a bit of a different meaning. So that's why people typically translate using the word technology. And that's fine. I think we can work with that translation. We just have to know that technology here for Heidegger is not necessarily linked to what we call modern technology. It applies to anything that's being used to make something, right? So the process of making something, even at the most simple, basic level, right? And this is important because he's using it to talk about very traditional, even ancient forms of technology and modern technology, right? So be careful with the word technology. So in this essay, he tries to define what really is the difference between traditional technology, the way it's been used throughout human history, and then modern technology. So let's look at what that process is for Heidegger, these two different processes. Traditional technology for Heidegger is, of course, a way of producing things. Now, he doesn't really use the word produce. He uses the word bringing forth. So in producing something, again, in the very traditional context, right? In producing something, we bring forth something. Now, you say, isn't that the same as producing? Yes, you can always say it seems the same, but bringing forth, the idea of forth to the foreground, it implies more the idea of bringing something to presence. And this is exactly what Heidegger says. You bring something into a presence that wasn't there before. And in that respect, Heidegger even talks about producing or bringing forth as a process of revealing truth. Now, we need to make sense of this, of course, but immediately you might say that's strange because truth seems to be about the relation between knowledge or something you claim to know and the world, right? If knowledge is true, or if what you say is true, then it corresponds to the world. So how can producing something be true? It's real, but it's not true, right? But Heidegger doesn't see it that way. So when he thinks of truth, basically he's going back to the ancient Greek notion of truth, which is aletheia, which means uncovering. So truth for Heidegger is something that is being revealed. Now, you say revealed, that means something was covered before and then it's uncovered, right? So again, it's not just a relation between what I say and what goes on in the world. The world reveals something to me. And this is a very important thing in Heidegger's philosophy. We can't really go into detail of the fundamental principles of Heidegger's philosophy. But the important thing to know here is that for Heidegger, things don't start with humans, the human world, the human subject, and then we need to establish a relation to the world. That would be the sort of fundament of modern philosophy, 17th, 18th century philosophy. Heidegger's way of thinking is very different. When he talks about revealing, when he talks about truth, it implies that we as humans we're always embedded in what he would call being, so in the world. Perhaps the easiest image to make sense of this is when we're born, right? Heidegger says we're thrown into existence, right? We're thrown into being. In other words, we humans, we're not at the origin of our own being. So you can take that image and apply it to anything that's part of the human world. We're not at the origin of being. We are embedded, we're part of being. Or again, as Heidegger would say, we are in the world. This is the way we exist as humans. We're in the world, right? So there's not that fundamental divide between humans and ideas and everything that's part of the human world and then the real world, right? All right, so you need to know that. So going back to technology now, what technology is bringing forth is a form of truth that's being revealed. That's what he would say. Now, the easiest way to make sense of this is just look at an example. So the example Heidegger gives himself is the windmill. So what happens with a windmill? Well, the wind causes the sails to turn, and thanks to that, the grains can be crushed or milled, and then you obtain flour, right? So we see that what is brought forth here is, well, the product, right, is flour. But that only makes sense, the production of flour only makes sense in the constellation of a windmill using the wind. So what it reveals is a relation of us to the wind, and thanks to the actual device that we created, the windmill, a relation that we can use nature for that purpose, right? So that which is brought forth, Heidegger would say, it owes to the cause of what brings it forth. So in this case, it's the windmill, the wind, and the miller, of course. So all of that, he would say, Heidegger, is responsible for bringing forth that product. So what does that mean? It means that we are in this relation where we're responsible for something. Now, responsible, just to be clear, for Heidegger, it's not a moralistic notion here, right? It's more responsibility in terms of its being, and that's why he's talking about revealing. That's why he's talking about truth. We, not just the miller, not just the human, but in that constellation I talked about before, it allows something to be revealed about the way we are in the world and about nature. So that's traditional technology. Now, what happens in modern technology? Well, Heidegger says, in modern technology, nature is no longer working as something that helps us bringing forth something. The mode of revealing is quite different. In modern technology, nature is being ordered or summoned to bring forth certain resources that can then be integrated in a production process and can be accumulated. So he talks about nature as a standing reserve. And so it's not hard to recognize the production system I was describing earlier, which is nature just reduces itself to resources that we can then exploit, right? Now, for Heidegger, this is a fundamental difference with traditional technology. In this modern technology, there is no more bringing forth, bringing something to presence. No, it is summoning something that has to function exactly as we plan things and then being accumulated in the process. And that's why for Heidegger, modern technology is only possible with science, with modern science, right? Because there's this element of predictability, calculation that is necessary for nature to be reduced to resources that can be accumulated, etc. So for Heidegger, this is a fundamental difference. So it reveals, again, technology always reveals a certain truth. So it reveals a truth about the way we relate to our world and the way we are in our world, which is a form of exploitation of nature, a form of accumulation, a reduction of nature to resources that can be accumulated in a production process. And so also nature then appears as just the object of science, right, with its calculability, etc. So what does this mean? Now we're trying to get back to the idea of climate change. It means that this system of production that we have today reveals the truth of the way we are in the world today. Heidegger talks about exploiting nature, etc. So we can go a step further now and say that the truth that's being revealed of our existence today, with the urgency of climate change, etc., is that our existence is being revealed as self-destructive, right? We are in a production system where not only we're exploiting nature, but we're exploiting it to the point where we're threatening our own existence in its very being, right? With the environmental mess that we find ourselves in today, to put it bluntly, right? So human existence is now being revealed as subordinated, remember we talked about subsumption, to modern production to the extent that it's being threatened in its own being. I think this is the truth that's being revealed here. So I think what's interesting when we use Heideggerian notions like we did here to talk about these issues, climate change, capitalist production, etc., is that you sort of anchor them into human existence. As I just said, it's our very being here that's at stake here. So we're not sort of giving a social critique at the level of the economy or production, etc. It's really anchored into our very being. And one consequence of that is that the solution, if you're thinking in terms of solution, if we're now trying to go back a bit to sort of more political questions, political debates, the solution is not simply technology, right? I know you hear people talk about we need to invest, for example, invest in renewable energy, etc. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, of course, but the conclusion of what I'm trying to develop here today is that it's much more fundamental, right? It's linked to our very existence, our very being. It's not simply a practical or technological question, right? That's the conclusion. So anyway, I think putting it in those terms allows us to see in a different way the urgency of the matter, right? It's not just saving nature, as people sometimes still insist on calling it, but it's about really asking ourselves, is this mode of existence something that we can live with, right? That is really the question here. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about today. So thank you for watching, and we'll talk about something else next time.